The fluorescent lights of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center hummed through the third-floor corridor at 3:47 hours, casting sterile shadows across linoleum that had witnessed more grief than most battlefields. A man in navy blue maintenance coveralls sat motionless on a plastic chair outside the intensive care unit, his calloused hands folded across his chest, his breathing settled into the shallow rhythm of exhausted sleep. His name tag read Tours, M in faded embroidery, and a small American flag patch clung to his right shoulder, frayed at the edges from years of industrial washing. The wedding ring on his left hand caught the light as his head tilted forward, chin touching collarbone, surrendering finally to gravity and fatigue after a double shift that had stretched into its 16th hour. He'd been mopping blood from emergency room tiles when his daughter texted him 3 words that changed everything. "Dad, come now." His supervisor had tried to stop him at the service entrance, citing protocol and shift coverage. But Miguel Torres hadn't become a single father by asking permission to love his child. He'd simply walked through that door, still carrying the smell of disinfectant and floor wax, his daughter's tears already visible through the ICU observation window, where she stood beside a hospital bed, surrounded by enough medical equipment to launch a space shuttle. What nobody noticed in that quiet hour before dawn was the figure approaching from the opposite end of the corridor, moving with the measured pace of someone who'd learned long ago that rushing changed nothing about outcomes, only about how you arrived at them. The woman wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray Georgetown hoodie, running shoes that made no sound against the floor, but she carried herself with a posture that decades of service had welded into her spine. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her face held the kind of lines that came from squinting at horizons most people never saw. She'd driven through the night from Annapolis, ignoring 3 calls from her aide and 1 from the Chief of Naval Operations, because some debts couldn't be settled through proper channels or official correspondence. The oak leaf cluster on her keychain caught the light as she paused 10 feet from the sleeping janitor, studying his face with an intensity that would have made junior officers check their uniform alignment. Recognition flickered across her features, followed by something deeper, something that looked like memory colliding with disbelief, and then settling into the heavy certainty of confirmed impossibility. Admiral Rebecca Vance hadn't planned to sleep on anyone's shoulder that morning. She'd planned to deliver condolences, sign necessary paperwork, and return to the academy before her absence created questions she wasn't ready to answer. But standing there in that fluorescent corridor, looking at Miguel Torres' exhausted face, she felt 27 years collapse into the space between heartbeats, and suddenly she was back in the cockpit of an FA-18 Super Hornet screaming through hostile airspace over the Strait of Hormuz. Her instrument panel lit up with more warning lights than a Christmas tree, her wingman dead in the water, and a voice on the radio calmly talking her through hell, with the patience of someone describing how to fold a paper airplane. She'd been Lieutenant Commander Vance then, flying her 48th combat mission off the USS Theodore Roosevelt, leading a 4-ship strike package against Iranian coastal radar installations that had been painting coalition aircraft for 3 weeks straight. The intelligence briefing had been clean, the weather forecast favorable, the opposition estimated as moderate. All the usual lies that sounded reasonable in air-conditioned ready rooms 600 miles from anyone shooting at you. They'd gone in low and fast, hugging the deck at 400 knots, maintaining radio silence, watching their radar warning receivers for the electronic signature of surface-to-air missile systems locking onto their aircraft. The strike itself had been textbook perfect, their GPS-guided munitions impacting within 2 meters of designated coordinates, secondary explosions confirming ammunition storage detonation, threat eliminated. Then they'd turned for home, climbing back to altitude for the carrier recovery. And that's when the sky had opened up with golden tracers and surface-to-air missiles that rose toward them like angry spirits refusing to accept their dismissal. Her wingman, Lieutenant Marcus Huang, had taken the first hit, a Chinese-made HQ-9 missile that turned his Super Hornet into an expanding fireball at 12,000 feet. No ejection, no radio call, just one moment flying formation on her right wing and the next moment gone, replaced by burning debris tumbling toward the Persian Gulf. The second missile had tracked toward her aircraft, proximity fuse detonating 15 meters from her tail, peppering her vertical stabilizers with shrapnel that severed hydraulic lines and shredded control surfaces. Her stick had gone mushy immediately, the aircraft yawing hard right, nose dropping despite full left rudder input, her carefully maintained formation discipline dissolving into a desperate fight against physics and fire. The master caution light illuminated, followed by half a dozen system warnings, and her heads-up display started showing her things no pilot ever wanted to see. Dual hydraulic failure, flight control degradation, fuel leak from the port external tank, fire warning from the starboard engine bay. She'd keyed her radio, voice steady despite the 6G turn she was pulling to evade a third missile, reporting her situation to the E-2 Hawkeye running airborne command. Dragon 2-3 is hit, multiple systems degraded, attempting emergency recovery. The response had come not from the Hawkeye controller, but from a voice she didn't recognize, male, calm, speaking with the unhurried cadence of someone completely disconnected from the emergency unfolding around her. Dragon 2-3, this is Reach 3-7. I have your position, I have your status, and I'm going to get you home. First thing, confirm you have manual reversion capability on your flight controls. She checked her backup instruments, her aircraft bucking like an angry horse, black smoke now trailing from her damaged engine, altimeter unwinding through 8,000 feet. Negative manual reversion, hydraulics are shot, I'm on degraded fly-by-wire only. The voice had acknowledged this information without concern, without urgency, as if she just reported a minor inconvenience rather than a catastrophic system failure. Copy that. You're flying on borrowed electricity and good intentions. Check your fuel state. She'd glanced at her gauge, watched the numbers spinning downward faster than normal, confirmation of the leak she'd already suspected. I'm losing fuel, estimate 20 minutes to flame out. The voice had processed this information, paused for exactly 2 seconds, then delivered instructions with the precision of a surgeon describing an incision. 20 minutes is plenty. You're 60 nautical miles from the boat, they're steaming into the wind for immediate recovery. I want you to reduce throttle to minimum sustainable airspeed, maximize your glide ratio, and start a slow descent toward feet wet. She'd followed those instructions because there wasn't anything else to follow. No ejection seat salvation over hostile territory, no friendly airfields within range, nothing but ocean and the increasingly uncertain promise of a carrier deck that felt like it was sliding further away with every passing second. The voice had stayed with her through every mile, every system failure, every moment when her aircraft decided to test her nerve with a new mechanical betrayal. When her starboard engine finally quit at 15 miles out, the voice had talked her through single-engine carrier approach procedures she'd practiced 100 times in simulators, but never imagined executing with damaged flight controls over hostile waters in the dark. When her approach turn had gone wide because her aircraft wouldn't track properly, the voice had calmly corrected her geometry, guiding her back to centerline like a patient driving instructor, teaching a teenager to parallel park. When her trap had been hard enough to crack 2 vertebrae and collapse her landing gear, the voice had been there on the radio, steady as granite, saying 5 words that somehow contained everything she needed. Dragon 2-3, welcome home, warrior. She'd spent 4 days in the ship's medical bay before they'd medevaced her to Landstuhl, another week there before returning stateside, 6 months of physical therapy learning to walk without limping, and 2 years of career purgatory while Navy medicine decided whether a pilot with compressed vertebrae could return to flight status. During all that time, she tried to identify Reach 37, the voice that had guided her home. She'd filed official inquiries, interviewed Hawkeye controllers, studied communications logs, even pulled strings with friends at Naval Air Systems Command. Every search had come up empty. No call sign assignment, no aircraft identification, no personnel record. The official after-action report attributed her successful recovery to exceptional airmanship under emergency conditions, without mentioning the voice that had made that airmanship possible. Her own aircrew had confirmed hearing the transmissions, but nobody could explain where they'd originated or who had been speaking. Eventually, she'd stopped looking, filed the mystery under unsolved problems, and focused on the career that somehow survived her broken back and became something neither she nor anyone else had predicted. Now, standing in a hospital corridor watching Miguel Torres sleep in a plastic chair, she was looking at the source of that voice. She knew it with the absolute certainty of someone who'd heard those same cadences, that same unhurried calm, in the most critical moments of her life. 27 years and she still heard it sometimes in her sleep, that voice talking her through emergencies and dreams that always ended with her walking away from crashed aircraft. She moved closer, each step deliberate, until she stood directly in front of him, close enough to read the wear patterns on his coveralls, the fading of his American flag patch, the exhaustion written into the creases around his eyes. She didn't wake him immediately. Instead, she lowered herself into the adjacent chair, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose back still remembered old injuries, and she studied his face the way a cartographer studies terrain they'd only previously seen from 30,000 feet. The features were weathered now, carved by years and circumstance into something harder than the face she'd imagined belonging to that voice, but the underlying architecture was there, visible beneath the accumulated mileage of living. She could see discipline in the set of his jaw, competence in the steadiness of his breathing even in sleep, and something else, something that looked like profound weariness that went deeper than missed sleep or double shifts. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who worked with industrial equipment and cleaning chemicals, whose labor left visible marks that didn't fade. His wedding ring was loose on his finger, the kind of loose that came from weight loss or time or both, and on the inside of his left wrist was a tattoo, faded and stretched with age, that showed a simple compass rose beneath 3 words in block letters: "True bearing home." She recognized military ink when she saw it, the kind of permanent declaration that marked people who needed external reminders of internal commitments. Admiral Vance had conducted formal inspections of aircraft carriers, reviewed operational readiness of strike groups, testified before congressional committees on defense appropriations, and maintained composure through enough high-stakes situations to fill several memoirs that would never be written. But sitting in that hospital chair, inches from a sleeping janitor who'd once saved her life from 600 miles away without even knowing her name, she felt something crack in the professional armor she'd been maintaining since 400 when the phone call had come through. The call had been brief, sterile, delivered by a Navy chaplain using the careful language reserved for situations where grief needed to be contained within procedural boundaries. "Admiral, I regret to inform you that Petty Officer First Class Sophia Torres, assigned to Naval Medical Center Portsmouth, was injured in a training accident yesterday evening. She's been transferred to Walter Reed. Her condition is listed as critical." The chaplain had provided room numbers, contact information for the attending surgeon, assurances that everything possible was being done. What the chaplain hadn't mentioned, because regulations didn't cover such things, was that Sophia Torres had been Admiral Vance's unofficial mentee for 3 years, one of those rare junior sailors who possessed both extraordinary technical competence and the kind of moral clarity that made senior officers remember why they joined the service in the first place. Admiral Vance had met Sophia during a routine inspection visit to Portsmouth, found her working on a training simulator that had been tagged as non-operational for 6 months, watched her diagnose and repair an obscure electrical fault that 3 contractors hadn't been able to fix. The young petty officer had explained her troubleshooting methodology with the same unhurried calm her father had once used to guide damaged aircraft home, breaking complex problems into manageable steps, never rushing, never assuming. They talked for 20 minutes about diagnostics and decision-making, and Admiral Vance had left that conversation with two distinct impressions. First, that Sophia Torres was destined for significant things if the Navy was smart enough to recognize her value, and second, that she reminded the Admiral of someone, though at the time she couldn't have said who. Now, watching Miguel Torres sleep in a chair outside his daughter's ICU room, the connection became obvious, the genetic inheritance of competence and calm visible even through exhaustion and civilian work clothes. She wondered if he knew what his daughter had become, if he understood that the young woman fighting for her life 20 feet away had inherited more than just his voice, had somehow absorbed the same capacity to function perfectly under impossible pressure. The training accident had been straightforward in its mechanical causation and devastating in its human cost. Sophia had been conducting emergency egress training in a mock-up of a damaged submarine compartment, demonstrating proper evacuation procedures to a group of junior sailors, when a structural support failed and 300 pounds of steel framework collapsed onto the training space. Two sailors had walked away with minor injuries. Sophia, who'd been positioned closest to the failure point, had taken the full impact across her back and shoulders, her body instinctively shielding the younger sailor standing beside her. The medical assessment had been clinical and brutal. Compression fractures in 3 thoracic vertebrae, ruptured spleen, internal bleeding, possible spinal cord involvement pending further imaging, prognosis uncertain. Admiral Vance had read the injury report in her car, pulled over on the Baltimore-Washington Parkway because her hands were shaking too badly to drive safely, and she'd sat there in the dark watching headlights stream past, thinking about the particular cruelty of a universe that would break the back of a sailor whose father had once talked a pilot through landing with a broken back, as if trauma were some kind of hereditary condition that followed families through generations. She hadn't planned to come here. She drafted official statements, arranged for victim advocacy support, ensured Sophia's military benefits and medical care would receive command attention. She'd done everything an admiral was supposed to do, everything protocol demanded, everything except the one thing that mattered, which was showing up in person to acknowledge that some debts transcended rank and regulation. So she'd driven through the night, and now she sat in a hospital corridor next to a sleeping janitor who didn't know she existed, who had no idea his voice had once been the difference between a controlled landing and an uncontrolled crash, who'd saved her life without ever receiving recognition or thanks or even basic acknowledgement of his contribution. The injustice of it sat in her chest like a weight, and she understood suddenly that she'd come here not just for Sophia but for him, for Miguel Torres, whose competence had somehow gone unrecognized, and whose extraordinary contributions had been filed away under bureaucratic amnesia. Miguel stirred slightly in his sleep, his head tilting further forward, the weight of exhaustion pulling him down. Admiral Vance watched the movement, calculated angles and leverage, understood that he was maybe 30 seconds from waking with a terrible crick in his neck that would haunt him through tomorrow's shift. She made a decision that would probably end up in someone's memoir someday, the kind of decision that had nothing to do with military bearing or appropriate conduct, and everything to do with recognizing that some acts of service deserved acknowledgement, even if they arrived 27 years late. She shifted her position slightly, angling her shoulder, creating a stable surface, and when Miguel's head tilted further, she was there, catching his weight, letting him rest against her Georgetown hoodie, supporting the man who'd once supported her through the worst crisis of her aviation career. His breathing didn't change, exhaustion keeping him submerged beneath awareness, and she sat there holding absolutely still, maintaining her position, providing the kind of basic human comfort that admirals weren't supposed to give janitors, but human beings had been giving each other since the invention of sleep and sorrow. They stayed that way for 11 minutes, an admiral and a janitor, connected by circumstance and unknown history, both keeping vigil over a young woman whose life had become the intersection point of their two trajectories. The fluorescent lights continued their electrical hum, morning shift nurses began arriving for their 600 handoff, and somewhere in the distance, a helicopter landed on the medical center's rooftop helipad, delivering another emergency that would require another family's vigil. Admiral Vance used those 11 minutes to study Miguel's face from an angle that would never be repeated, memorizing features that belonged to a voice she'd been hearing in her memory for over 2 decades. She noticed things close observation revealed: the small scar above his left eyebrow, the gray threading through hair that had probably been black once, the permanent squint lines that came from years of looking into industrial lighting, the way his hands relaxed in sleep but never fully opened, as if even unconscious he remained prepared to grip a mop handle or a tool or whatever instrument his work required. At 3:58 hours, Miguel Torres opened his eyes, that instant transition from sleep to wakefulness that marked people accustomed to interrupted rest, whose bodies had learned to surface quickly through the layers of unconsciousness. His first awareness was of the wrongness of his position, head supported by something that wasn't a chair back, weight distributed in a way his body didn't recognize. His second awareness was of the face inches from his own, female, older, watching him with an expression that combined patience and something else he couldn't immediately identify. His third awareness was the rising panic of a working man who'd fallen asleep on duty, whose lapse in professional vigilance had led to physical contact with someone who was clearly not another janitor, judging by the quality of her clothing and the intensity of her gaze. He jerked upright, pulling away from her shoulder, words already forming an apology. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Admiral Vance raised one hand, palm out, the universal gesture for stopping, and her voice when she spoke carried the same calm authority Miguel Torres had once used to guide dying aircraft. "Don't apologize. You were exhausted. I made a choice to let you rest." Miguel blinked, processing this information, his brain slowly engaging through the fog of fatigue and the disorientation of waking in an unexpected situation. He looked at the woman properly now, taking in details his initial panic had missed. She wasn't young, probably older than him by a few years, but she carried herself with a ramrod posture that made age seem irrelevant. Her gray eyes were direct, assessing, the kind of gaze that saw through surface appearance to structural integrity beneath. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, and there was something about the way she occupied space, something that suggested command or authority or both, that made Miguel's instinctive working-class deference kick in automatically. "I should get back," he said, already starting to rise. "My supervisor, he'll be looking for." Again that raised hand, that quiet authority stopping him mid-movement. "Your supervisor can wait. Sit down, Mr. Torres. We need to talk." The use of his name froze him completely, one hand on the chair arm, half standing, confusion replacing his departing panic. He didn't know this woman, had never seen her before in his life, was absolutely certain their paths had never crossed in Walter Reed's endless corridors or service spaces. She saw his confusion, nodded slightly as if confirming something, then spoke 5 words that made his confusion deepen into something closer to vertigo. "I need to thank you." Miguel lowered himself back into the chair, not because he decided to obey, but because his legs suddenly felt unreliable, his exhaustion combining with bewilderment to create a sense of unreality about this entire interaction. "Thank me. Lady, I think you have me confused with someone else." "I'm just a janitor, I don't." She interrupted him again, but this time her voice carried an edge, something sharp beneath the calm that made him stop talking immediately. "You're not just anything, Mr. Torres, and I don't have you confused with anyone. You're exactly who I've been looking for, and I'm 27 years late with this conversation." She reached into her hoodie pocket, extracted a phone, navigated through screens with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd made peace with modern technology, then turned the display toward him. The screen showed a photograph, slightly grainy with digital zoom, clearly captured from some kind of official archive. It showed a young man in uniform, naval aviation insignia visible on his chest, standing beside what looked like a mobile communications unit, the kind of equipment that could be rapidly deployed for temporary operations. The young man wore a flight suit and held a headset, and even through the photograph's technical limitations, Miguel could see the focused intensity on the man's face, the posture of someone actively engaged in important work. He stared at the image, and something cold moved through his chest, recognition and memory colliding with the defense mechanisms he'd spent 15 years building against exactly these kinds of collisions. "That's you," Admiral Vance said quietly, watching his face. Lieutenant Junior Grade Miguel Torres, Naval Aircrew Rescue Swimmer qualified, communications specialist temporarily assigned to combat search and rescue coordination aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt. This photo was taken 3 days before you talked me through a damaged aircraft recovery that everyone agreed should have killed me. Miguel's hands had started shaking, small tremors he couldn't control, physical manifestation of something breaking inside his carefully maintained boundaries. He tried to speak, but his throat had closed around words that wouldn't form coherently. Admiral Vance continued, her voice softening slightly, acknowledging the impact of her revelation. "I didn't know who you were. I tried to find you, spent months searching, but somehow your assignment never made it into official records. Your call sign wasn't logged properly, and by the time I had enough rank to demand answers, the people who might have known had transferred or retired or died. I gave up. I shouldn't have, but I did. And then tonight I walked into this corridor and heard your voice, and I knew." Miguel found words finally, pushed them through the constriction in his throat. "That was a long time ago, different life. I don't do that anymore." It sounded weak even to his own ears, denial masquerading as fact, and Admiral Vance's expression suggested she heard through the deflection to the pain underneath. "I know you don't. I did my research during the drive here, pulled your service record, read the details. Medical discharge, honorable conditions, full benefits. The official language is very polite about why the Navy decided a decorated rescue swimmer with perfect performance reviews suddenly wasn't needed anymore." She paused, and her next words carried the weight of personal experience. "I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry the service used you up and threw you away. I'm sorry your competence wasn't enough protection against bureaucratic stupidity. And I'm sorry it took me 27 years to find you and say what should have been said immediately. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for staying on that radio when you could have handed me off to someone else. Thank you for using your voice and your knowledge and your absolute refusal to accept my death as an acceptable outcome. You gave me a future, and I've tried to honor that gift by being worthy of the rescue. I don't know if I've succeeded, but I've tried." The silence that followed stretched between them, filling the fluorescent corridor with the weight of unspoken history. Miguel Torres, who'd learned long ago that emotion was a luxury janitors couldn't afford, felt something crack in the defensive architecture he'd built around the man he used to be. His eyes burned with tears he refused to release, his hands clenched against the shaking, and when he finally spoke, his voice emerged raw and broken. "My daughter is dying in there because she inherited my stupid need to save people. She threw herself in front of falling metal to protect some kid who will probably never remember her name. Just like I used to do, before the Navy decided I was too broken to be useful anymore. So don't thank me, Admiral. Whatever I gave you, it came with a price I'm still paying, and now Sophia's paying it too, and I don't know how to make it stop." Admiral Vance absorbed this outburst without flinching, let his pain exist in the space between them without trying to minimize or redirect it. Then she leaned forward, closing the distance, and her voice when she spoke carried the absolute certainty of someone stating verified facts. "Your daughter is alive in there because she's tougher than the circumstances trying to kill her, just like you were tough enough to survive whatever broke you. And just like I was tough enough to land a dying aircraft because you gave me the information and confidence I needed. That's not a curse, Mr. Torres. That's a legacy. And if you can't see the value in it right now because grief is blocking your view, then I'll see it for you until you're ready. She reached out, placed her hand over his trembling fingers, and the contact was brief but deliberate, acknowledgement of shared experience. I've been exactly where Sophia is right now. Different injury, same fight. I know what the next 6 months look like, and I know she's going to need you to believe in her recovery even when she stops believing in it herself. Can you do that? Can you be for her what you were for me? The voice that refuses to accept failure as an option. Miguel Torres looked at this admiral whose name he still didn't know, whose shoulder he'd accidentally slept on, whose life he'd apparently saved in a conversation he barely remembered from a career that felt like someone else's biography. He thought about Sophia lying in the ICU, fighting battles he couldn't see against enemies he couldn't identify, and he thought about the young woman she'd been at 7 years old, asking him why mommy wasn't coming home from the hospital, forcing him to explain terminal cancer in language a child could process. He thought about every double shift he'd worked to keep their apartment, every parent-teacher conference he'd attended still smelling of industrial cleaner, every sacrifice that had seemed insufficient when measured against the enormity of raising a daughter alone. He thought about the moments when Sophia had looked at him with confusion, asking why he didn't do important work anymore, why he cleaned floors instead of saving lives, and he thought about the inadequate explanations he'd offered, the partial truths that protected her from understanding that sometimes the world broke good people for no reason except institutional convenience. Then he looked at Admiral Vance, really looked at her, and he saw something he hadn't noticed in his initial panic and confusion. He saw a woman who'd climbed from lieutenant commander to admiral despite a broken back, who'd turned a near-death experience into fuel rather than limitation, who'd spent 27 years trying to find the voice that had saved her life. He saw someone who understood exactly what he and Sophia were facing, because she'd survived it herself. Someone whose presence here wasn't about pity or obligation, but about recognizing the strange mathematics of mutual salvation. And he understood, in that fluorescent corridor while morning shift preparations continued around them, that she'd given him something more valuable than thanks or recognition. She'd given him proof that saving lives had consequences that extended beyond immediate crisis, that the voice he'd used to guide one damaged aircraft home had set in motion ripples that became waves that became this moment, where two strangers connected across decades by the simple fact of competence, applied to desperate circumstances. Yes, he said finally, his voice steadying as he made the commitment, choosing belief over despair because an admiral who'd once been in his daughter's exact position was asking him to make that choice. Yes, I can be that voice for Sophia. I can refuse to accept failure. I can stay on the radio until she lands safely, no matter how long it takes. Admiral Vance nodded, satisfied, then rose from her chair with the careful movement of someone whose back contained old injuries and permanent hardware. Good. Then we're going to get through this together, Mr. Torres. You're not alone in this vigil anymore. And when Sophia wakes up, not if, when, she's going to find her father and her admiral standing there ready to help her navigate the recovery ahead. She extended her hand formally, offering connection and compact in a single gesture. Miguel Torres stood, ignoring his protesting muscles and exhausted joints, and he took that hand, feeling calloused palm meet calloused palm, the handshake of two people who understood that dignity came from work well done regardless of whether anyone noticed or applauded. Miguel, he said, choosing first names because rank suddenly seemed irrelevant to this particular alliance. Rebecca, she replied, returning the courtesy, acknowledging the space where military hierarchy gave way to simple human cooperation. They stood there, hands clasped, two people bound by the strange geometry of salvation and circumstance, both of them keeping vigil over a young woman who'd inherited the best qualities of a father whose competence had been systematically erased from official memory, but never from the lives he'd touched. The next 72 hours passed in the peculiar time dilation that marked hospital vigils, where minutes stretched into subjective hours and actual hours, compressed into indistinguishable blocks of waiting. Miguel returned to his maintenance duties, because bills didn't pause for family emergencies, working his scheduled shifts with a focus that bordered on mechanical, his body performing practiced routines while his mind remained anchored to the ICU 3 floors above. Admiral Vance returned to Annapolis to handle duties that couldn't be indefinitely postponed, but she appeared at Walter Reed every evening, arriving in civilian clothes, bringing coffee and practical food, and the kind of calm competence that made medical staff answer questions with more detail than standard family briefings provided. She pulled strings Miguel hadn't known existed, arranging second opinions from specialists, ensuring Sophia received care that reflected her value as both sailor and human being, leveraging her rank in ways that never felt like pressure but always produced results. They developed a routine without explicitly discussing it. Miguel would arrive after his shift ended, still wearing his coveralls, carrying the smell of cleaning compounds and floor wax. Rebecca would appear within an hour, having driven from wherever her duties had taken her, carrying updates from the Navy that she'd extracted through official channels Miguel couldn't access. They'd sit together outside the ICU, comparing information, discussing prognosis, maintaining their shared vigil with the patience of people who understood that healing operated on its own timeline. Sometimes they talked about Sophia, sharing stories that assembled a more complete picture of the young woman fighting for consciousness 20 feet away. Sometimes they talked about the Navy, about the ways it shaped people and discarded them, about the institutional failures that created situations like Miguel's medical discharge or Sophia's inadequately supervised training evolution. And sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, two veterans who'd learned that presence often mattered more than conversation, that showing up was itself a form of service. On the fourth night, Rebecca brought a folder with her, manila envelope marked with classification stamps that made Miguel nervous just looking at. She sat down in her usual chair, set the folder between them, and her voice when she spoke carried an edge he hadn't heard before. I found out why your service record disappeared. It took me 4 days and 3 violations of information protocol, but I found the explanation. Miguel looked at the folder, then at her face, trying to read the emotion behind her carefully neutral expression. Do I want to know? She considered this question seriously, then nodded. Yes, you deserve to know. It won't change anything about your current circumstances, but it will explain why your extraordinary contributions were systematically erased, and sometimes understanding the mechanism of injustice makes it slightly easier to live with the consequences. She opened the folder, extracted a single page, redacted heavily but with enough visible text to convey its meaning. After the mission where you guided me home, someone initiated an investigation, not into the emergency itself, but into how a junior officer with rescue swimmer qualifications ended up manning a communication station and making command decisions without proper authorization. The investigation found that your assignment had been impromptu, filling a gap when a specialized communicator got food poisoning hours before the strike package launched. Your commanding officer had made a field decision to use your radio experience and combat search and rescue training to provide coverage. It was exactly the kind of adaptive decision-making that makes missions succeed, but it violated several bureaucratic protocols about qualification requirements and authorization chains. She paused, letting him process this information, then continued. The investigation concluded that while your performance had been exemplary, their word, not mine, the irregular nature of your assignment created liability exposure. Their recommendation was to recognize your competence while ensuring you were never again in a position to make similar unauthorized contributions. The solution they implemented was to medically discharge you following a minor training injury that should have resulted in a few weeks of light duty. Miguel stared at the redacted document, watching the systematic dismantling of his career spelled out in bureaucratic language that made injustice sound like reasonable policy. They fired me for being too good at a job I wasn't supposed to be doing. Rebecca's voice hardened. They fired you because your competence embarrassed someone whose career depended on maintaining the fiction that certain positions required certain qualifications, and adaptive problem-solving threatened that comfortable fiction. Your medical discharge protected them from having to acknowledge that a rescue swimmer could perform communications tasks better than specialized communicators, or that field-expedient solutions sometimes produced better results than proper procedure. She took the document back, returned it to the folder, and her next words carried the weight of personal commitment. I'm going to fix this. It'll take time, and it won't undo 15 years of working maintenance when you should have been training new generations of search and rescue specialists. But I'm going to ensure your service record accurately reflects what you contributed. You deserve that much, and the junior sailors who could have learned from you deserved better than the Navy's bureaucratic cowardice. Before Miguel could respond, the ICU door opened and a surgeon emerged, still wearing scrubs, pulling his mask down to reveal a face lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from spending hours repairing human damage. He looked at Miguel, then at Rebecca, his gaze lingering slightly on her posture and bearing in a way that suggested he'd spent enough time around military brass to recognize rank even in civilian clothes. Mr. Torres. Miguel stood immediately, tension flooding his system, preparing for whatever news had brought the surgeon out of his domain. I'm Miguel Torres. This is Admiral Vance. How's my daughter? The surgeon's expression shifted into something carefully neutral, professional mask that could hide either good or bad news. Petty Officer Torres is awake. She's asking for her father. Relief hit Miguel like a physical force, strong enough that he swayed slightly, his exhaustion and fear suddenly having permission to release their grip. Rebecca's hand caught his elbow, steadying him, her voice calm. That's good news, doctor. What's her condition? The surgeon acknowledged Rebecca with a nod that conveyed respect and information in equal measure. She's stable. We've reduced sedation and she's breathing on her own. The spinal imaging shows no permanent cord damage, though she'll need extensive physical therapy for the vertebral fractures. The ruptured spleen was successfully repaired. She's got a long recovery ahead, but I'm cautiously optimistic about full function eventually. He turned his attention back to Miguel, and his voice softened slightly. She's in considerable pain, but she's fighting it with the kind of determination I usually only see in career military. You raised a hell of a sailor, Mr. Torres. Miguel felt something break loose in his chest, emotion he'd been containing through 4 days of vigil suddenly finding release, tears spilling down his face in defiance of every instinct that said janitors didn't cry in front of admirals and surgeons. He didn't try to hide them, didn't apologize for them, just let them fall while his hands shook and his breathing went ragged with relief. Rebecca maintained her grip on his elbow, providing physical anchor while he processed the news, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm authority she'd used throughout this vigil.